This ritual was so barbaric, so humiliating, that even Rome, the empire famous for blood-soaked gladiator fights, banned it. But in the city of Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, it wasn't just allowed, it was performed. Night after night. Imogen, a child, no older than 10, is forced to lie down on a stage in front of 80,000 spectators. She isn't clothed. She isn't protected. She's surrounded by trained animals, released to perform acts that make the crowd roar with laughter and hunger. Coins rain down onto her small body as the audience cheers to the crowd. This is entertainment.to the child. It is trauma.to history. It is the beginning of something terrifying, because one of those little girls didn't just survive it, she studied it. She learned from it, and she used it. That girl would one day become Empress Theodora, the most powerful woman in the Byzantine world, feared by senators, courted by emperors, and remembered for commanding the massacre of 30,000 people in a single day. Her childhood wasn't just suffering. It was a training ground. While others broke under the weight of abuse, she discovered something far more dangerous. Desire makes men weak. And if she could control their desires, she could control their power. The story you're about to hear isn't just about survival, that it's about how one of history's most brutal practices forged a woman ruthless enough to bend an empire to her will. This is the shocking story of how humiliation, exploitation, and revenge created the empress who ruled Rome from the shadows. Now, let's step back for a moment, because what happened in that arena wasn't just disturbing entertainment. It was something far bigger and far darker. In Byzantium, what you saw in the hippodrome wasn't just a show. It was the engine of an entire system. A system that turned poverty into profit and children into commodities. It wasn't just a stage performance. It was legalized trafficking on an industrial scale. And here's the terrifying truth. This system didn't just chew people up and spit them out. Sometimes it created monsters, because when a child is taught that their only worth is in humiliation, in submission, in being controlled, two things can happen. They can break. Or they can learn how to flip the game. That's what makes Theodora's story so chilling. Every coin thrown at her body, every senator who treated her like property, every audience that demanded her suffering, they were all training her. Without realizing it, they were teaching her exactly how the powerful think, exactly how their desires make them weak, exactly how humiliation can be turned into domination. And that's why this matters, because the little girl forced onto a stage didn't stay there. She grew up. She became the Empress of Byzantium, and she used everything she had endured, every scar, every secret, every lesson in weakness, to control the most powerful man in the empire. And through him, she controlled Rome itself. The stakes weren't just personal, they were imperial, because when Theodora finally took power, she wasn't just ruling. She was ruling with the psychology of someone who had survived the unthinkable. And when 30,000 lives were hanging in the balance, it was those very lessons, learned in the arena, that decided who lived and who died. To understand Theodora's rise, you first need to understand the world she was born into. Because Byzantium wasn't just another empire. It was a pressure cooker. By the year 500, Constantinople was the beating heart of the Eastern Roman world. Its streets were crowded, its palaces glittered with gold, and its hippodrome could hold 80,000 screaming spectators. But the city wasn't ruled only by emperors or laws. It was ruled by factions. Two factions. To be exact, the Blues and the Greens. An outsider. They looked like sports teams, cheering on their favorite charioteers at the races. But in reality, they were political machines. They controlled jobs, controlled entertainment, controlled government positions, even life and death in the streets. Every citizen belonged to one faction or the other, and your allegiance determined your entire future. For Theodora's family, their lifeline was the Greens. Her father, Acacius, was the official bearkeeper for the faction, the man who trained massive brown bears for the hippodrome's bloody spectacles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and in Byzantium, it meant protection. Then, suddenly, everything collapsed. When Acacius died, the Greens should have looked after his widow and 3 young daughters. That was the rule. That was the system. But corruption has no loyalty. A bribe changed hands. The bearkeeper's position was given to another man, and overnight, Theodora's family went from protected to abandoned. Her mother faced a choice no parent should ever face: watch her children starve or feed them to the very entertainment machine that had destroyed their father's place in society. She chose survival, and survival, in Constantinople, came with an unthinkable price. Theodora was only 10 years old when her life in the hippodrome began, and what happened there was something even ancient Rome, a culture built on blood and cruelty, had called too extreme. The performance was called Leda, and the swan, a child, would lie completely naked on stage while trained geese pecked barley seeds from her body. 80,000 people roared with laughter, cheering and tossing coins at a girl who could barely understand what was happening. It was theater, they said, but in truth, it was systematic humiliation wrapped up as entertainment. And when the show ended, that was only the beginning, because Byzantine law made it clear: if you were an actress or a performer, you were legally equal to a prostitute. Submission wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Behind the curtains, in the private rooms of the hippodrome, children as young as 8 were forced to entertain senators, merchants, and wealthy men who saw them not as human, but as disposable bodies. This was Theodora's world. But here's what made her different. While most children broke under the weight of this abuse, Theodora was watching. She was learning. Each night, she saw the same pattern repeat itself. Powerful men, senators, generals, merchants, reduced to pathetic, desperate creatures when their desires took control. They threw away dignity for a few moments of pleasure. They gave up secrets, showed weakness, revealed how fragile their power really was. For Theodora, the hippodrome wasn't just a prison. It was a classroom. Every humiliation was a lesson. Every performance was a masterclass in manipulation. By the time she was a teenager, she understood something that would define the rest of her life. Desire is a chain, and the moment a man is bound by it, he can be controlled. The world thought it was destroying her. In reality, it was forging her. By the time Theodora reached her teenage years, she was no longer just another performer in the hippodrome. She was its star attraction, not because she was the most beautiful, not because she was the most glamorous, but because she was the most intelligent. At 16, men weren't just paying to see her on stage. They were paying for her attention, for her company, for the strange, magnetic power she held over them. They thought they were buying pleasure. What they didn't realize was that Theodora was studying them, cataloging every weakness, every insecurity, every way desire stripped them of control. And then came the moment that changed everything. A Syrian governor named Hysebulus, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the empire, visited Constantinople. When he saw Theodora perform, he didn't just want her for a night. He wanted to own her completely. He offered her something no one else had: escape from the hippodrome, a life of luxury, and the promise of safety as his personal concubine. For Theodora, it must have felt like salvation. After 6 years of degradation, here was a way out. And so she followed him to Libya, leaving the arena behind. But this was no fairy tale. Inside Hysebulus's palace, she discovered the same truth she had always known. Powerful men are never satisfied. He believed he owned her. He believed his wealth and armies made him untouchable. But Theodora was no longer a helpless child. She tested his desires, pushed his limits, and watched how quickly his dignity crumbled when he was trapped by his own obsession. Every night became another lesson in manipulation. She learned which words shamed him, which fantasies controlled him, which weaknesses could sway even his political decisions. That he thought he was her master. In reality, he was her experiment. And when he finally realized that this young woman was using him, shaping him, bending his judgment, his rage erupted. That he cast her out, stripped her of wealth, and left her with nothing in the Libyan desert. But here's the twist. That betrayal didn't break her. It completed her education. The girl who had once been powerless was now armed with the most dangerous knowledge of all: that even the most powerful men in the empire could be undone by the very thing they thought gave them strength. When Hysebulus cast her out, Theodora had nothing. No wealth, no safety, no protection, just the desert sun, the taste of dust, and the knowledge that she had been discarded like trash. But instead of destroying her, that betrayal sharpened her resolve. She began the long journey back to Constantinople, traveling ship by ship across the Mediterranean, She sold her body to survive, yes, but this time, she was no longer just surviving. She was testing. Every merchant, every captain, every man who thought he was using her became another lesson. She discovered how to pull secrets from pillow talk, how to turn shame into leverage, how to transform desire into control. Each night, she added another page to the mental playbook she had started as a child. By the time she reached Alexandria, she was already evolving into something else. There, she embraced Christianity, specifically the Monophysite movement, a sect considered heretical by many. To outsiders, it might have looked like a spiritual awakening, but for Theodora, it was strategy. Religion offered her something the hippodrome never had: a community, a network, a power base outside the world of exploitation. And then came Antioch. The turning point. It was there she met Macedonia, a fellow performer with ties to the Byzantine blues faction. Through whispers and connections, Theodora learned something extraordinary. In Constantinople, a man named Justinian, the heir to the empire, had heard of her. Not just her beauty, not just her past, but her mind, her cunning, her ability to survive where others had perished. When she finally returned to Constantinople, she was no longer the broken girl who had left. She was battle-tested, politically connected, and, most importantly, unforgettable. And when Justinian first laid eyes on her, the stage was set. He was 40 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and already being groomed for the throne. By all accounts, he should have chosen a respectable noblewoman as his partner. Instead, he fell under the spell of a former actress, a woman the law branded a prostitute. Their relationship was a scandal. Senators whispered in disgust. How can the heir to the empire marry her? The old laws were clear. Once an actress, always an actress. Byzantine law made sure entertainers could never rise into political respectability. And yet, Justinian was relentless. He wasn't just in love. He was addicted. Every private moment with Theodora deepened his dependence. Every whispered conversation, every night together, tied him tighter to her will. Standing in their way was one final obstacle: the Empress Euphemia, the wife of Emperor Justin. She despised Theodora, calling her unworthy, warning Justinian that he was throwing away the empire for lust. And then, mysteriously, Euphemia died in her sleep. Almost immediately, the laws changed. New decrees allowed entertainers to marry senators. And in 525 CE, Theodora walked down the aisle of Hagia Sophia, draped in imperial purple, and became Justinian's wife. The hippodrome's exploited child had just become the most powerful woman in Byzantium. 7 years after marrying Justinian, Theodora finally faced her ultimate test. It was January 532 CE. Constantinople was on fire. The blues and greens, normally bitter enemies, had united under a single cry: Nika, conquer. It wasn't just a political protest. It was an explosion of rage, and their target was clear: the emperor and, more specifically, the empress who had clawed her way from the hippodrome to the throne. For 5 days, the city was chaos. Fires ripped through neighborhoods, the Senate House, the great Hagia Sophia itself, reduced to ash. Blood spilled in the streets as mobs surged with torches, screaming for vengeance. Inside the palace, fear gripped the court, but Justinian's advisors begged him to flee. Take the treasury, they pleaded. Escape while you still can. Even his generals were ready to abandon the city. And for a moment, the emperor wavered. The ships were waiting in the harbor. Safety was just across the water. All he had to do was walk away. But then Theodora stood, the daughter of a bear keeper, the girl who had been paraded before jeering crowds, the child who had endured coins thrown at her naked body. Now, she looked across the trembling council and delivered the speech of her life. My opinion, she said calmly, is that the present moment is not the time for flight. Though it may bring safety, it brings dishonor. May I never live a day when I am not addressed as empress. As for me, I approve of an ancient saying that royalty is a fine burial shroud. Silence fell. Her words cut sharper than any sword. What she was saying was simple: better to die in purple robes than live in shame. And Justinian, still bound by the obsession she had nurtured for years, listened instead of fleeing. He gave the order that would change history. Generals Belisarius and Mundus sealed the hippodrome. where over 100,000 rebels had gathered to celebrate their supposed victory. Then, the soldiers moved in. What followed was slaughter. The same arena where Theodora had once been humiliated as a child now became the stage for her revenge, the By nightfall. 30,000 bodies littered the sand. The revolt was over. Theodora had faced the mob that demanded her death, and she had crushed it with a ruthlessness born from the very torments they once cheered. From that moment forward, no one doubted her power, not the Senate, not the church, not even Justinian himself. The exploited child of the hippodrome had become the iron will of an empire. When the smoke cleared from the hippodrome, 30,000 corpses lay in the sand. And in that silence, one truth became clear. Theodora was no longer just the empress by marriage. She was the empire's will. From then on, Byzantium didn't just have one ruler. It had two. Justinian sat on the throne, yes, but Theodora ruled beside him. Not through ceremony, but through control. Whispers spread through the palace. She had her own network, her own spies, her own government behind the curtain, servants, eunuchs. Even entertainers moved quietly through Constantinople, carrying back secrets. Who was meeting in private? Who was slipping into whose bedchamber? Which senator had shameful desires? Theodora collected every weakness and stored it like weapons in an arsenal, because she understood better than anyone. Men don't fall to armies. They fall to shame. And when enemies stood in her way, she struck without hesitation. Popes were exiled, generals were ruined, rivals, like Queen Amalasuntha of the Ostrogoths, were eliminated in ways that carried Theodora's signature blend of humiliation and brutality. Her methods weren't always swords or poison. Sometimes, they were psychological daggers, breaking a man's mind the way hers had once been broken as a child. But her legacy didn't end with shadow wars. She also reshaped the law itself. The same woman who had been forced into prostitution as a child now banned forced prostitution across the empire. Brothels that trapped women were shut down. Women were granted new divorce rights. Rape, once treated as a private matter, became punishable by death, with the victim inheriting the attackers. Property.to some. These reforms looked progressive.to others. They looked like revenge carved into law, because every decree Theodora passed was aimed directly at the abuses she had survived. She wasn't just making laws. She was rewriting the rules of survival for women in Byzantium. And yet, her vision wasn't simple mercy. Those rescued from the brothels were often forced into convents, controlled just as strictly as Theodora had once been controlled. Her laws gave with one hand, and took with the other by the time she died in 548 CE. Theodora was only 48 years old, but her death shattered Justinian. The emperor who had once commanded the greatest armies of the East crumbled without her. He never remarried, never ruled with the same. Today, tourists walk through the ruins of the hippodrome in Istanbul. They take selfies where once 80,000 people screamed for blood and humiliation. Most don't realize they're standing on the same ground where a 10-year-old girl once lay naked, coins thrown at her body like she was less than human. Or that decades later, in that very same arena, 30,000 people were slaughtered at her command. Theodora's story is not simple. She was a victim. Yes, a child crushed by one of the most brutal systems in history. But she was also a predator, a woman who learned to weaponize the very abuses that once destroyed her. Her reforms saved countless women from the fate she endured. Her intelligence reshaped Byzantine politics, and yet tens of thousands died because of her ruthless will to survive. So how do we judge her? Was she the hero who turned pain into power, protecting future generations from exploitation? Or was she the monster forged by trauma, proving that cruelty doesn't just destroy people, it can create destroyers? That's the haunting lesson Theodora leaves us with, that sometimes the worst systems in history don't just produce victims. Sometimes they produce empresses, and her story forces us to ask, if survival demands becoming ruthless, at what point does the survivor become the villain?